Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. When the lights have finally turned on in Kananaskis and the world leaders are going back to wherever they came from, our parliament's got to get back to work. And there's a very tight time frame on this, which kind of leads us nicely into the discussion we want to have on the podcast today about Bill C-5. Which is getting an awful lot of heat from some opposition members, and usual suspects, I think, is probably a pretty appropriate phrase here when you look at some of the comments. The latest one, of course, is Green Party leader Elizabeth May, who is pretty upset, apparently, about Bill C-5, suggesting that this is a new low, she calls it, in government's contempt for Parliament. Pretty strong words, and Elizabeth May, of course, who is very, very adept at hyperbole, seems to be right on her game with these sorts of comments. Speaking at a news conference just the other day, she says she hasn't seen anything like this since the Conservatives and Stephen Harper had their huge omnibus bill some years ago. Yeah, we remember that bill. We discussed that at great length, of course, on the radio show at the time. And the reason why that bill was so egregious was simply because what that was proposing was simply to eliminate an awful lot of the guardrails and checks and balances when it came to legislation and due diligence about legislation. And I think what Elizabeth May is doing, and maybe even some of the other critics are doing, is conflating a couple of issues here. Bill C-5 does not eliminate those protections. For instance, and I'll use as a comparator, Doug Ford's bill, let's hurry up and get things done bill. That's what I'm calling it, but I mean, that was the intent of it, that he just rushed through the Ontario legislature before they went off on their summer break. Which did basically outrule and eliminate an awful lot of the environmental protections and other protections and consultation protocols that should be in place before things can happen. But the intent of the federal bill that the Carney government is trying to get done here, from my standpoint, as I read this, is to basically move the process along. Because if there's one thing that Canadian parliamentarians are great at, I mean, they have mastered the game of obfuscation, all right? Why do something in a day if you can stretch it out over 6 months or a year? And that's what parliamentary committees do. That's what politicians in general seem to do in Ottawa. They just want to delay. Let's study this. Let's study that. Let's have a debate, an open debate in the Commons about, the color of ink that they used on this or why this. On and on and on it goes. I mean, it's no damn wonder that nothing gets done in this country. And Prime Minister Carney talked about this a week or so ago when he introduced this legislation. We used to build big, important things in this country, and we did it well. He used examples of the St. Lawrence Seaway, but other major projects too, that were necessary in building this country, building this country's economy. We don't do that anymore. It takes too long for us to get anything done here. If there's a committee that's going to be struck, and they will be, of course, to oversee applications for major projects, these guys spend the first 6 days of their committee time deciding on what kind of coffee to bring in to the meeting. I mean, they just can't move anything forward. Part of it's politically driven because the opposition members on those committees, and there are more of them because this is a minority parliament, just basically seem to think it's their job to delay and to put up roadblocks. That's their job as opposition. No, it's not. It's to help move the country forward. And yes, to hold the government's feet to the fire. You don't just rubber stamp anything, but unless you've got a legitimate reason to delay something or to ask questions about, they just let the damn thing go through and let's get something done here. And this is what we need. And I think that's what Carney talked about during the campaign. And I think this is what he's trying to do now with this legislation. I don't want to hear 6 weeks of delay and 6 weeks of obfuscation, which is what we always seem to get from our parliamentarians. Get the job done. If it's going to be pipelines, it's not saying let's not do any environmental assessments on these, but there needs to be a way to put the rush on some of these projects. We do it all the time. This is a priority in our lives. We have to get this done. We have to build this. Get it done. Instead of spinning our wheels as we do so many times. This is what I think frustrates Canadians so often, is we get the talk from these politicians all the time, but they're not walking the walk. In other words, they just don't deliver on an awful lot of these things. Pipelines being a great example of that, but energy corridors, energy transformation. I'm not going to sit here and say, hey, I'm agreeing with Danielle Smith on that, but I am to a certain degree. She's pretty happy about this proposed legislation because it's going to move some of these projects along. It doesn't say just forget all the rules and forget all the protocols that have to follow. It's saying speed them up. instead of taking 5-10 years for some of these projects to go through this meandering process of approval, they'd like something done at 2 years at the maximum, faster if it's at all possible. That's a very laudable goal. And I applaud the government for finally putting something on the table that's going to move us in that direction. Some of the stuff that I'm hearing from some of the opposition parties or some of the critics is the stuff you hear about all the time. That well, it might lead to a situation where the government would not consult properly with, for instance, indigenous groups. It doesn't say it will lead, it might. Coulda, woulda, shoulda. So as a result, there's a slight chance that this might actually, not benefit some of the consultation of the process. So let's just kill the whole thing. That's the mentality that we've been dealing with in Ottawa for years, and it's got to stop. And this bill, I hope, is going to move us in the right direction. By the way, the wild card that the opponents of these sorts of legislation always drag out is, well, it's unconstitutional. That's something they love to throw around in Ottawa these days. Oh, it's going to go to the courts, and the courts are going to shut it down. Well, it's interesting because some constitutional experts have already weighed in on this and said, no, that's not going to happen. And it's I think interesting to listen to that side of this and listen to the experts that have looked in on this. That there has been an idea and in the past some challenges to very similar sorts of laws and protocols to try to move the process forward, and those have been supported by the Supreme Court. Okay, sections 21 and 23 of the bill allow the executive branch to bypass existing rules and processes in 13 laws, including the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, the Indian Act, and the Impact Assessment Law, through a regulatory process that does not need to be approved. It doesn't say forget about them. It says they'll go through a regulatory process. Okay, and it's interesting. Governments have tried to do this and have done something like this in the past. As a matter of fact, there's a name for it that I was not aware of. I'm sure you weren't either. They call these the Henry VIII clauses, which is a reference, of course, to Henry VIII, the King of England at the time, who preferred to govern by decree rather than through Parliament, which is it's kind of an acerbic reference to this. But the courts have already decided that these attempts to move processes along by speeding up some of these checks and balances, they've been challenged before, and the courts have said, yeah, they can do this. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to do it with every piece of legislation, but I think the Prime Minister was pretty clear about that these are going to be projects that have been deemed by the government and by the Cabinet to be absolutely essential for economic development to move forward. It doesn't mean, paving over paradise, but when we're talking about some of these major infrastructure projects that have been on the books in some cases for years and that are very necessary right now and key components in our economic progress going forward, yeah, there has to be some sort of an accelerated process for this, because there are too many people that just want to throw something into the gears to stop the whole thing. And that's why we're in the conundrum that we're in these days. It's got to stop. And this legislation seems to be, I think, a move in the right direction to try to get that done. Constitutional experts seem to give this a thumbs up. The idea here that this is simply going to say, well, to hell with all these checks and balances, I think is an extreme over simplification of this. And you can't hold up legislation like this simply because you say, yeah, well, maybe it will get abused at some point down the road. If in fact there are abuses, that's what the whole checks and balances system is there for in the first place, so that at that point you can put that process into place and hold people accountable. But in the meantime, let's build things. Let's get things done. The only way this economy is going to move forward right now is by this sort of legislation that's going to say, cut the red tape, not eliminate the red tape, but speed through the process so that we can get these things done in our lifetimes in some of these situations. They put a closure element to this too, because they'd like to have this thing done by the end of this month. End the debate on it at that stage. If you've got questions, bring them up now. It's not suggesting that we don't want to hear your questions, but they're just saying, please do it now. Stop dragging this out. And that seems to be the message and the mantra. And I'm one frustrated Canadian that says, yeah, it's about time that somebody move forward on some of this stuff. And we'll see just how this Parliament reacts to it. The usual suspects like Elizabeth May and others, of course, are always going to wave their arms and say, no, it's not going to happen. And some environmental groups who do have their hearts in the right places oftentimes are suggesting that, we've just got to slow this process down. No, we don't. No, we don't need to do that. Quite the opposite. It's not suggesting things like the Species at Risk Act is going to be tossed out, but there's got to be a way to accelerate the process to do those assessments with these relevant pieces of information and guardrails that are in place. And I'm thinking that what the government's proposing here does just that. Now, how's Parliament going to react? At this point, after all these years, I'd be reticent to make any kind of prediction as to how they're going to do this. Sending it back to committee is basically saying, well, let's just continue doing what we do in Ottawa, which is not much of anything. Slow processes down. So I'll be watching to see how the parliamentarians, not just the Liberals, but the opposition parties, respond to this piece of legislation. Are you ready to actually not just do the talk, but do the walk? Are you ready to move things forward? Are you ready to make sure that we're starting to build things once again? The ball's in your court, Parliament. Let's hope you do the right thing. That's it for this edition of the podcast. As always, you can watch us and catch us on any one of the platforms that you follow all the time. Always like to get your input into this. Tell us what you think about the projects. Tell us what you feel about the podcasts. Back and forth on this. It's that dialogue, I think, that idea and that opportunity to try to gain information and exchange ideas about this that I think is healthy for our democracy and healthy in trying to deal with some of the misinformation that seems to be just out there now on so many different sites. We need to be informed. We need to broaden our horizons and try to get as much information on that, and try to do that with the Bill Kelly podcast. And we invite you to be a part of that and to share your thoughts and ideas too. Thanks as always to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.